Matt Rojansky is director of the Wilson Center's Kennan Institute. He returns for part two of a discussion we were having earlier about Vladimir Putin, Russia, and the U.S. and the West. I want to ask you about security concerns from the Russian perspective. When Vladimir Putin looks at Ukraine and Crimea and the ports and all of those things, what does he see?
Well, I think first and foremost, he sees an opportunity, a historic space which Russia has traditionally occupied. I think he sees some threat in the sense that he just looks at a different data set when he thinks about what NATO is about, what NATO is after, what the United States is after, what Germany is after. You know, I think most people in the West don't think of NATO as particularly threatening to anyone, right? It's a defensive alliance. Maybe in some sense it's mostly political nowadays. But from the Russian perspective, of course, you know, for half a century it was aimed at defeating them. And so I think it is seen as something hostile and threatening. And as NATO expands around the former Soviet periphery, that is seen as a threat. And Ukraine really is the last bulwark, right? If NATO were to make inroads into Ukraine over the last decade, there have been a number of joint Ukrainian-NATO exercises in the Black Sea, and I think Putin sort of encapsulated that feeling perfectly when he said in his speech 2 weeks ago to the Russian, to both chambers of the Russian parliament, he said, "We're annexing Crimea because we are happy to have NATO sailors as our guests in Sevastopol harbor, where the Black Sea Fleet is headquarters, but never will we be their guests."
So the story goes that George Herbert Walker Bush promised that Warsaw Pact countries would not be recruited to NATO. Bill Clinton didn't keep that promise. George W. Bush didn't keep that promise.
The argument about that goes even further. It's been claimed by the former U.S. ambassador to the Soviet Union, who was ostensibly in the room at the time, Jack Matlock, and others, that the promise actually was that even East Germany would not host any NATO forces. So in fact, with German reunification, it would not lead to 1 inch further of NATO expansion eastward. That's still somewhat in debate, and I think one of the big arguments from the other side is the folks who say, look, that was a promise made to a nation that doesn't exist anymore. And so just like the conventional armed forces in Europe or some of the nuclear treaties, the details would have to be renegotiated once you end up in a situation where the successor states have their own prerogatives. They have their own right to choose whether they want to be part of NATO, whether they want to be part of the European Union. Moscow no longer decides on their behalf. And that is fundamentally what changed in the 1990s. All that said, being just very frank about the politics, did the United States run the table? Did the United States essentially overrule and ignore any objections that the Russians had to NATO expansion? You bet we did.
What will work in terms of engaging Putin and Russia? Sanctions are the seeming default setting when military response is not possible. Right. What will work?
Well, sanctions, I think, tends, at least the kind of sanctions we've seen deployed, tend to play more into the Kremlin's hand than supporting our position. For one thing,
because it supports their characterization of what we're about.
That we're interested in regime change more than we are, actual security or actual negotiation. Regime change simply because they're targeted sanctions, right? What are we really about? We're about targeting the regime, and that's all that Putin has to show. But in a way, we also help him distinguish between reliable and unreliable allies, oligarchs, senior officials within the country. That's an old problem we have with sanctions. That is, you release a list of names of people who are being sanctioned, and you kind of give a guide to your game plan to the adversary, and I think we're doing that in Russia now as well. But most of all, it's just the impact question. It's the idea that, look, if you know anything about Russian history and anything about the Russian character and the way that a very considerable number of elite Russians and ordinary people see Russia's engagement in Ukraine, its annexation of Crimea, possible actions in eastern Ukraine, you realize this is fundamental for them. And it's at a level where they're prepared to make sacrifices that we in the West just wouldn't even contemplate. As a German friend recently said to me, a couple degrees difference or a couple pennies difference in the cost of heating your house in Germany, you're going to have street protests, right? The Russians are prepared to endure some pretty serious costs, and that's what we're threatening. Well, they may end up paying those costs and continuing on their way.
Speaking of Germany, Angela Merkel is seen as having a better relationship with Putin than some other Western leaders. Is there any opportunity there?
That may have changed very recently. My sense is that while there has been mutual respect for a long time, there's no particular affection between the two. I also think Angela Merkel has become increasingly disillusioned with the notion that Putin simply doesn't see reason, that he sees a different worldview than she does. Where we have not arrived yet is at a kind of Cold War state of negotiations where we acknowledge that there are simply unresolvable differences, irreconcilable, to use the Hollywood term, between our two sides, but that those differences are inherently so important because the relationship is so important that we need to find interlocutors, whether it's Merkel or anybody else, who can talk through those differences. We haven't arrived there yet. We still believe that we can essentially bludgeon the Russians into agreeing with our position. If we sanction them enough, if we threaten them enough, they'll come around, and I think that's probably mistaken.
I won't insult you by asking for predictions in a volatile situation, but just a one general quick response on the notion of how dangerous this situation is. Is it something that could escalate into something significant, or is this likely to be a contained type of scenario?
Well, I'd like to think that we're not going to see any further outright occupation, invasion, conflict, but I tend to believe this is an exceptionally dangerous situation for the simple reason that the Russian message, take us seriously or else, has never yet received a satisfactory answer. And if you know Russia, if you know the simple capabilities that we're dealing with here, which include nuclear confrontation and mutually assured destruction, the or else can start to seem a lot scarier than anything we've thought about for about 2 decades.
Matt Rojansky, thanks for joining us.
Thank you.